This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Hello, and welcome to the Wednesday Twilight Show. This is with Morgan Whitfield and Todd Brennan. Today is Wednesday, the 8th of May, and we have as a guest Rizwana Sheikh, who's an expert timetabler. Today we're going to be talking about the possibilities and impossibilities of timetabling.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello, and welcome to the Wednesday Twilight Show. My name is Morgan Whitfield, and this is actually the first time that I have hosted. Because of that, I hope that everyone who is listening feels especially special. Just a little bit about me. I am an educator who lives in Abu Dhabi. I have been in the United Arab Emirates for the past 12 years. Before that, I taught in the UK, in the Midlands in Birmingham. And if you can hear my accent, that is a dulcet Canadian accent. I have taught in the British curriculum for years, but before that, I was an educator in Canada. With me today, I have invited Rizwana Sheikh. For those of you who don't know her, Rizwana is someone that I have had the joy of working alongside in many different events in Abu Dhabi. She's extremely active in the Abu Dhabi community. Riz is an accomplished, results-driven, and reflective leader with over 7 years of timetabling and data management experience. She has a proven track record of successfully managing and optimizing school timetables to enhance student learning outcomes. Basically, she is incredibly impressive, and I've seen her work wonders with a timetable at several different schools. She brings a unique blend of analytical skills and strategic vision to the table, and a passion for continuous improvement. On top of that, Riz is intimidatingly smart. She's a further maths and maths teacher who has been a key member of the Abu Dhabi Teaching Conference Committee and a dynamic presenter. So I'm really excited to talk to her about timetabling today. And I'm hoping that we can hear Riz. Riz, are you able to speak? I just want to make sure that I have you connected.
Hello, Morgan. Yes. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, it's wonderful to hear your lovely voice.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the introduction.
Well, we're really, really happy to have you. We're excited just because timetabling seems like such an important topic to tackle. When I was discussing, well, what should my very first show be about? I remember speaking with Todd and saying, well, at this time of the year, we are starting to look at our timetables for next year. And it's so, so important that we get those timetables right. It's the foundation of a school. I remember a few years ago, I had a head of secondary who built our timetable, and it seemed like he would hole himself away for a few weeks just to build it. And at the end, what he would always do is he would print off that timetable in a huge, huge format and put it on his wall, and it looked like a piece of art. It was absolutely gorgeous, just lots of different colors and lots of different columns. It was really, really impressive. And I remember thinking, this seems like the most complicated puzzle that a person could ever put together. So again, I'm really, really impressed that you do this every single year. And I'm kind of wondering why you put yourself through it.
Oh, was that a question?
Yeah, I think that you're crazy, Rose. So I just wondered, why were you first attracted to timetabling, and why do you go into it every single year? You seem incredibly plucky about the entire endeavor.
I think the first time I went into it, I didn't actually know what I was doing, but I thought, oh, this just could be a massive Sudoku puzzle. So let's give it a go. So I think I guess it comes from my mathematical background. It's a problem that you need to solve. It's a puzzle that needs to fit. And I think it's the joy of finally putting those pieces together that attracts me towards doing it and putting myself through it year on year.
It's really funny because you have done it year on year. I'm coming into timetabling as a novice because I've never actually done it myself. But I'd like to introduce Todd now. So Todd is my co-host, and he is someone that has a little bit more timetabling experience. Todd, do you want to kind of introduce yourself and speak to your timetabling experience a little?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes. So my experience is much more limited than Riz's, and it's been a number of years since I've done it. And unlike Riz, I'm glad to have seen the back of it. It is an interesting puzzle when you do it, and mine was on a much smaller scale than what Riz has done it. So I'm kind of intermediate, I would say, on the novice end. But it was certainly something that I found fascinating at the time. And it did give me a huge insight, something that I'd previously just complained about, essentially.
And what's that?
Well, for me, it was always just I felt like we hadn't prioritized the right things, and I felt that certain things could be slightly different in terms of just in terms of we'd occasionally have double blocked lessons, and I thought, oh, this is nonsense. Why's this happened? And it wasn't until I tried to fit those pieces together that actually I saw that it was much more complicated.
Yeah, it seems like in timetabling, there's always conflicting priorities, and you're always negotiating to make a timetable actually fit what a school needs. And when I think about great timetables that have worked for schools, I don't think sometimes that I even noticed that the school worked so well because it had this incredible foundation. I think when you look at the pillars of great timetabling and what a great timetable has, it really means that there's a balance for all stakeholders. And it's also looking at the logistics of a school. Riz, if you had to look at a great timetable, what are the ingredients or the pillars that make a really, really smooth timetable?
Well, there's lots of factors to consider. I would say the first one for me would be optimization. So, an effective timetable would make really good use of resources such as your classrooms, your teachers, your specialist rooms, which could be your science labs, your DT labs, the sporting facilities that you have, and really maximizing, the utilization of those rooms and resources. And I think one of the most important ones, like you said, is having that balance. So I really believe that there should be a fair balance in terms of distribution of subjects. So we should have a mix of academic subjects, creative subjects, physical subjects, just to keep that momentum going throughout the day and to promote that focus for our kids. And just speaking about our children, our students, a good timetable should be centered around them. So we need to understand who our students are, what they can cope with, and how we're going to build a curriculum and a timetable that will help them to flourish and thrive. Another important factor would be flexibility. So those of you who are in the UAE will know that sometimes we do need to be flexible, and we do need to accommodate changes. And sometimes we don't have a lot of time to accommodate those changes. So it can be really difficult to make changes to an existing timetable if you haven't built in that flexibility. It can actually disrupt the whole schedule if you haven't done it right in the first place. So yeah, flexibility is definitely important. And I'd say communication as well. I think it's, as a timetabler, you understand what you've done, why you've done it, why you've placed lessons in certain places. But the people that you're delivering that timetable to might not always have that knowledge or that understanding. And I do think, everyone should have a buy-in to the timetable. So it's important to make sure that, your students, your parents, your teachers, especially your heads of department, understand why it is the way it is. And it's really important to have that open conversation with them before you start that process. And what I quite like doing, I think I've done this twice now, is actually create a timetable working party. And so I've always sort of timetabled, I say always, I think my first 2 years was just senior school timetabling, but after that it was early years right the way up to sixth form. So just making sure you have a timetable working party where you're liaising with, different sections of the school. So you have a representative from early years, from lower primary, upper primary, secondary, teachers who are teaching across different phases of the school, making sure you've got their opinions and making sure you're evaluating what's gone well in this timetable for this year, what can we do in order to improve it for the following year. So you have to always be reflective of the timetables that you've written as well.
Wow, there's so much to unpack there. It's so funny because when you started off saying, well, you have to look at things like facilities and specialist rooms. I remember one timetabling friend once said to me, oh, I do PE first. So I look at all the needs that we have for sport and physical education, and everything is built around that because those are facilities that really have to be considered, and that use of that facility is so tricky to balance. So I always thought that was really funny, but I think what you've said is don't look at the facilities and make that the limiting factor, but always look at centering students and never the other way around, which is the way that everything in teaching and learning in any school should be. So I think it's really interesting the way that you kind of frame that as a way to be agile and flexible, is kind of making sure that you know what the purpose of the timetable is, which is to deliver a really strong curriculum. I think what you said about communication is really, really key. I know that every once in a while I've had a timetable, kind of fluke of the timetable that made me really, really unhappy, and I didn't quite understand why. I remember once being timetabled against science, which meant that when I was usually teaching multi-ability classrooms in geography, that then I had sets, and the sets that I had for science had a huge impact on the way that I was teaching in geography. And I didn't like that at all. And it wasn't until I sat with the timetabler for a while that I kind of got an understanding of why that had occurred. But after a long conversation, the same thing did not happen the following year, which I think comes back to your idea of having a working party. I have seen timetablers who work in isolation, and it does seem like in the end, it has to be one person in a room kind of making those decisions. But it's interesting that you said that you have a timetable working party. I remember going on a lower primary learning walk and looking at their timetable, and they had some of the same problems that we had in secondary with the length of lessons within the school day. And it just showed that across the school, there were changes that we wanted to make to the timetable that were actually pretty universal that I didn't anticipate. So having all those stakeholders in one place seems really, really important. I'm just looking at the time now. I'd like to play some advertisements, and then I'd like to kind of look at any of our call-in listeners. If anyone wants to text in any questions, we'd be really welcome to have your input. For now, here, please listen to a word from our sponsors.
I've always considered myself to be a caring head teacher who acts sensitively to support staff mental health. But what I found increasingly difficult was managing the negative impact on staff mental health when resolving issues related to their employment or daily work. Heartfelt Leadership has been developed by Teachwell Toolkit as a handbook to support head teachers to overcome the challenges of school improvement while supporting staff well-being. We know that difficult conversations can quickly turn into conflict if procedures are not fully transparent, understood and followed. Our handbook takes you through step-by-step processes while maintaining mutual respect, avoiding conflict and finding solutions.
At Bloomsbury Education, we're passionate about supporting teachers with high-quality professional development books from leading experts. Whether you're navigating your first crucial years as an early career teacher or a more experienced teacher looking to refresh your practice or take a step up into leadership, our award-winning books are here to help. We publish practical books to support teaching across primary and secondary, from the very best in research-led practice to trusted advice on inclusivity, behaviour and curriculum design. Visit the Bloomsbury Education website at bloomsbury.com/education to find out more, and use code BLOOMTTR24 to save 20% on all education titles. Bloomsbury Education, books for every step of your teaching journey.
This is Teachers Talk Radio News with John Gibbs.
Riz, welcome back. So what I wanted to kind of talk about now is the connection between timetabling and curriculum. What is that connection, and how does one enable the other?
I think it's important to start with the curriculum. So, like I said, put the needs of the students first. So, what kind of curriculum do you want to deliver here? And that curriculum should also align with a school's vision and mission. So, if you're advertising yourself as being quite academic and you're, dedicating more time to sort of the academic subjects, that needs to be sort of factored in. So it all starts with that curriculum map. So you need to decide what subjects you're going to offer, how much time you're going to give to those subjects. And of course, being here in the UAE, there are certain ministry subjects that we've got to give a set number of hours to per week, which are absolutely non-negotiable. So we've got to make sure that we fit around those as well. So we put the compulsory ones in, and then we look at what academic subjects, what physical subjects, what creative subjects we want on our curriculum. And then you go with that. And the next stage, after you've built your curriculum map, you're happy with it, your stakeholders are happy with it, you then look at how many children you've got in a school, how many sets you might require to deliver that curriculum, and that also informs your recruitment. So how many teachers do you need in order to deliver that curriculum? Does that answer your question?
Well, I just think it shows just how interconnected these things are. It is connected. So facilities, recruitment is massive. The class sizes that you have are going to be impacted. I remember being at a school where we had a strict rule that there would be no more than 18 students per class. And that lasted 1 year before we realized, okay, we need to have more students in classes in order to deliver the curriculum, just because of the time that we have, the teachers that we have, and the spaces that we have. So I think it's really funny because you think you might have non-negotiables, but yeah, they're all connected together, aren't they?
They are indeed.
I think it's really interesting what you said about compulsory subjects. We have teachers in schools all over the world. There are all these different curriculums that are being delivered, and there are some things that are compulsory. In the UAE, where we teach, it might be that we have to deliver 40 minutes of a social studies lesson per week, for instance. I recently had a discussion with a school leader where we were looking at that 40 minutes, and we said, well, we want to change the length of our lessons. We want to have 60-minute lessons. And the decision was made, well, no, we have to keep at 40 minutes because we can deliver 40 minutes of social studies a week. And it seemed like a great idea would just be, well, why don't we over-deliver on some of these compulsory subjects? What do you think about compromises like that? Is it okay? What is your ideal lesson length? You must see these kind of things all the time when trying to fit in a curriculum. Do you have any tips and tricks for dealing with a lot of these compulsory subjects, or their curriculum time that are prescribed for things like a GCSE or A-level course?
Yeah, so I've worked with two different models, actually three different models. And yes, it does make sense to have 40 minutes so that you give, your compulsory ministry subjects exactly the required time per week without taking away from other areas of your curriculum. But on the flip side, you have to think about whether the students in your school can handle having so many 40-minute lessons in a day. And it's fine for some students, not for all students. What I've found is I would say the ideal lesson time is probably between 45 to 55-minute lessons, which is what I timetable now. So we sort of timetable 55-minute lessons with a 5-minute changeover as transition time. And yes, it does mean that you give a lot more time to ministry subjects, but this is where you can use a 2-week timetable to help with that. And this is where you need to look at your primary schedule as well. So I've written a timetable this year where the secondary model is pretty much 55-minute lessons and 6 of those per day. But I have about 6 lessons in primary with a half an hour slot at the end of the day, which is my period 7. And that means that I'm able to timetable some 45-minute lessons in the middle of the day. So some of my ministry subjects would then go in the middle of the day, and then they would have some 1-hour lessons. So they've got some 60-minute lessons, some 40 to 45-minute lessons.
Hey, Riz, I think we may have lost you.
Oh, no.
Okay. Oh, can I hear you now?
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes, go right ahead. We just
Oh, I'm
lost
so
you for a second.
sorry. Oh, sorry. So, yeah, I'd say it goes back to just knowing who your students are, what they can cope with as well. And so the ideal lesson time is dependent on your students and your school. But I have found this year that 55 minutes works quite well because it means that you have quite a nice balance in the day. So you have 2 lessons, a break, 2 more lessons, then a lunch, and then your last 2 lessons before the end of the day. So I found that balance to be a lot smoother, I would say, than having, about 8 or 9 40-minute lessons.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's really funny. So I work in a school right now where we have 40-minute lessons, but they're in actuality 37-minute lessons because we have a 3-minute changeover. And 37 minutes seems like you can barely do anything. There's also the problem that if you have a teacher who might have 9 periods in a day, then the amount of planning that goes into 9 periods is very different than if you had 6 periods of 55-minute lessons. It means that you have to come up with 9 starters and 9 plenaries, for instance. It means that there's a lot more planning, and you might be moving kind of like your cognitive ability to move from teaching a year 7 lesson to then an A-level lesson to then a year 12 lesson and a year 9 lesson. It can be quite disorienting, I think, to kind of switch to make sure that you have all your resources all set and ready to go, as opposed to preparing maybe 3 less lessons a day by having those 55-minute lessons. Do you think that there is an impact on teaching and learning or teacher workload when it comes to the length of lessons?
Yes, I would say so, but I think it's about being creative. If you are going to have 9-period days that are 40 minutes each, you need to make sure you've got some double lessons. So when I used to timetable in that way, I always made sure there was at least one double, and whether that's on a teacher's timetable or on a year group timetable. And that, again, goes back to your curriculum plan. So it could be that you have a double DT in 1 week and a single DT in week 2. Could be that you have 6 classes per year group. So you might want to balance out for like 7 A, B, and C to have the double in week 1 and the single in week 2, and then switch that for the other year 7 classes. And that way you can end up timetabling some double slots, which then effectively reduces your 9 lessons down to 7, doesn't it? And it could be that, if you're a teacher teaching 6th form, it depends if your 6th form are single lessons or doubles. So I would often timetable 6th form always as doubles, with the odd single now and again. So you can actually reduce actually having 9 single lessons by making sure some of those are doubles.
That's really interesting. I actually love double lessons. So when that happens, it always seems like such a treat in my timetable. It meant that I got to have, I think, more impactful time. Students got to kind of like slow learn. I got more time to kind of give them feedback or do marking within the lesson. So I always really appreciated having doubles. I think the subject that I teach, it really flourished under that. Sometimes I found it really hard on a 2-week timetable, knowing that I would have a double 1 week and then a single the next. There was always the good week where it felt like I could get a lot more done with those students. Is there anything that you suggest to help teachers deal with a 2-week timetable when it might be a little bit unbalanced?
That's a really good question, Morgan. I think sometimes it very much depends on the teacher and how they manage their time, I guess. So sometimes I quite prefer to have 2 heavy days because I know I've got my light day coming up, and then I can plan it in advance what I'm going to do on that light day. So I guess, my advice would be just to try and plan in advance to, I guess, to cope. But yeah, a balance is always better between the 2 weeks. It isn't always going to happen. And I think that's the honest truth. For a range of subjects, I guess. I mean, especially if you're a subject that does have a double in 1 week and a single in the other. But this is where it's quite important for the timetabler to think, okay, if I've got, let's just say, use DT as an example. If I've got a DT teacher teaching all of year 7, well, we can flip the double and the single by having half of the classes with a double in week 1 and the other half with a double in week 2. And that would actually balance the teacher's timetable across the 2 weeks. Might not balance their days exactly, but it would hopefully balance the overall teaching load.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It was just so funny. I happened today to have done a cover lesson for art, and it worked really well. It was a cover lesson for art, and it was a double lesson, but it was interrupted by a break in between the two lessons. And the students loved that, especially for students that are so young. I think they appreciated the ability to go walk around, enjoy their break time, and then they got right back to work immediately. It was really great to see them so engaged, and I was amazed at the difference that a break can make. What do you think about spacing the day? Right now, I'm looking at our timetable for next year and thinking, well, because we have some new things going on with the growth of our school, should we have 3 periods and then a break, or 2 periods and then a break at the very beginning of the day? How do we space things out with lunch? And how do we make sure that we maintain students' attention near the end of the day? I always feel horrible and tired on that Thursday or Friday, the last period of the day. It's just a graveyard slot. How do you pace the shape of the day so that you can maximize student attention?
Yeah, I think it's having an equal balance, and I would say try to make sure you don't have more than 2 lessons after lunchtime, because if you've got 3 lessons after lunch, that's a lot to get through, and I think it's a lot for the teachers and for the kids as well. So definitely don't go for more than 2 lessons after a lunch. And if you are going to go for 9 40-minute lessons, again, try that double over break. The double over break, I love it too. I used to have a double over break with my year 11s, and I absolutely loved it because it means that you could get through a lot of content, give them some practice, they could go and have a break, come back to it, and it does actually work really well, like you said. But yeah, just make sure that the end of the day isn't too tiresome for everyone. And again, just think about the balance of subjects that you've got. So, could it be that we have, more practical subjects on those afternoons so that, it's a bit more, I guess, enjoyable and less straining for the children. So just looking really at the subjects that you're actually putting in the afternoon, or perhaps during those long periods. So could you put a double art followed by an English, or an English followed by a double art? So it doesn't feel like you've got, 3 different lessons that you've got to get through before you get a break.
Yeah, I think there's so much to unpack there. When I think about the different timetables that I've experienced at the 4 or 5 different schools that I have worked at, I wanted to ask about kind of balancing, because you're a whole school timetable or timetabler. When you look at, like, let's say a primary versus secondary school, or a prep versus senior school, one of the things that I've noticed has shaped timetables that I have lived through is the canteen. So the entire shape of the day kind of revolves and is different in primary and secondary because we can't have 900 or 1,000 kids in the canteen at the same time. So you end up making big compromises depending on, well, can we have kids go 5 or 6 lessons, because we need to make sure that primary students can have access to the canteen first, because they definitely can't go that long. What is the balance and the trade-offs that you have to make, and the different considerations depending on whether you are timetabling primary and secondary? And I guess on top of that, to make this question even more complicated, I've been in schools where staff has been shared and they teach across both primary and secondary. So PE staff that teach, they might teach early years and A-level, or you might have DT or drama teachers who are teaching year 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. How do you balance all those considerations when you're looking at a timetable?
So yeah, I would call those considerations constraints because that's exactly what they are. And yeah, every timetable has a constraint or 2 or more. Yeah, it is really difficult to balance. I would say the best thing to do would possibly to split your primary in a creative way. So what I've done in the past is I've had primary as 20-minute slots, okay? And what that means is you can absolutely have different break times, even for so you can have year 3 and 4 having the same break time and a different break time for 5 and 6, and then secondary having a completely different break time. But because you've timetabled your whole primary schedule in 20-minute chunks, when you need those specialists to go in, you need to just make sure you've got the same 40-minute slots that are available. And in some ways, that actually opens up more periods that you thought you might not have had elsewhere. So it could be that when year 3 and 4 are having their break, that is actually a secondary lesson. So your specialists are teaching there, but that frees them up to teach in 2 other 20-minute slots, which you would join to make a 40-minute slot back in primary again. And at first it seems like it's really, really complicated and it might not work. But it really is about opening Microsoft Excel, listing all your periods and your 20-minute slots, putting your secondary school timetable next to that, and just counting up, well, how...
Oh, Riz, I think you dropped out again.
I'm so sorry. I think it might be my phone. Can you hear me again?
Yep.
Oh, okay. Sorry. It's because my screen keeps turning off. Sorry about that. So yeah, I was speaking about just timetabling primary school in 20-minute blocks, and that gives primary school the flexibility as well, because if you restrict primary and say, well, everyone has to have a 40-minute lessons because, you know, that's what secondary have, they sometimes need a 20-minute lesson just for spellings, or they might need an extended 60-minute lesson if they're doing topic or a project. So I think it's really important for timetablers to understand all aspects of the school and understanding the curriculum of, you know, early years and primary as well. And I suppose it's quite helpful when you've got kids that age as well, so you kind of understand the curriculum a bit better because your own child is going through it. But it's also important to sort of liaise with your primary staff to see what their needs and their requirements are. And I've found in the past that that's worked quite well, having those 20-minute chunks, because it means that you are able to find time for the specialists. I would say the difficulty with that model is, again, the transition. So if you've got your specialist in sort of primary period 1 and 2, which might be the first 40 minutes of the day down in primary, and then they've got to run all the way up to secondary, I think that's where it becomes a little bit tricky. And then you just got to manage that. It depends also what you're using to create your timetable. So I use a software package called Keith Johnson, and what you can do on there is create your secondary schedule and then create a completely different primary schedule. So it's called multi-divisional timetabling. I don't know how long it's been out. I've done it about 2 or 3 times now, the multi-divisional timetable. It does work. And it does mean that the software helps you a little bit. It does something called blocking off. So after you've scheduled primary, you turn on the blocking off feature so that when you go into your primary schedule, it will show you exactly where your specialists have already been used in secondary. And then you can really see, okay, well, if I put the lesson there, have they got enough transition time? So I think it's also important to really utilize and make use of any timetabling software that you do have and that you...
I have to say, the 20-minute slots is absolutely brilliant. I totally know what you mean. I think that is really clever. And it can really help balance out those teachers that have to like move between. I was actually following some teachers who teach Arabic, actually, and they were teaching Arabic across the school. And I was amazed. I saw one teacher who hiked up 2 flights of stairs. She was moving from like the ground floor all the way up to the 3rd floor, and she had 3 minutes to do so. And what she had done that was so clever that I could not believe is she always had printed out on huge pieces of A3 with magnets that as soon as she walked into any classroom, because she happened to teach in many classrooms across our primary and secondary school, she would just put that on the board right away so that her starter and her learning objective were there. And it was a lot of prep because she knew that she didn't have time to fiddle with getting all of her tech set up. So it was very old school what she was doing, but it worked, and it allowed her to have really great start times to maximize those shorter lessons. But in terms of transitions, that's really tricky. It must be really difficult to kind of look at a teacher's timetable and then realize it's not just managing time, it's managing space. And transition time might be very unequal and put a larger burden on some staff or on some students. There's always that day when you're going to get all the way from the DT studio to, let's say, the football pitch. And that transition might take a long time. How do you design thinking of that transition and the space, the physical space of your school?
I think this is why it's really important to make sure that you're timetabling for that transition time. I think 3 minutes can be quite tight. In most cases, I mean, if you're on the same corridor, 3 minutes is more than enough time to get from one room to the other. But like you said, if you're going from the sports pitch right the way up to a second floor, for example, it might be a real rush, and you will have a few latecomers coming in. So, and that's why I think longer lessons actually solve the problem. So not having the 40-minute lessons, but rather the 55-minute lessons with that 5-minute transition time. And, 5 minutes is more than enough time to get from one place to the other. Now, going back to the teacher that you spoke about, who had to move across different floors, I think, yeah, sometimes that can happen. And, depending on the space and the size of your school, if there is a way to give that teacher a centralized room so that rather than her moving from class to class, a couple of classes can move to her at those odd occasions where she doesn't have a free period between two lessons, perhaps, or there's less transition time, or she's moving from, two far away spaces. If it's possible for classes to be brought up to her, that might be an idea around that too.
That's really amazing, actually. I was just thinking about protecting teachers' rooms because I have always preferred to have my own room. There's something about when you have your own room, not only are you consistently there, it allows you to kind of like set out all of your photocopying. You're keeping all your resources and books in that one space. You can line up and have all your tech set up for the day. It's really convenient. And plus, there's ownership of that room. So when it comes to things like displays or students simply knowing where to go because they know that the humanities department is this suite of classrooms right here, it's static. It makes it a lot easier, I think, for staff. Are there any ways to ensure as much as possible that teachers have their own room and that is their own protected space?
Sorry, I didn't hear you there, Morgan. Sorry, can you just repeat that, please?
Oh, I was just thinking about making sure that teachers have their own rooms. So making sure that they do have that protected space. I always know that my room is 207, and I teach all of my classes in 207. How do you make sure that you create static spaces as much as possible and you don't have teachers that are moving across the school constantly?
This all goes down to data analysis. So this is probably the first year that I've had my own room. So in my previous school, I was always moving between several different rooms. But if you've got a teacher who's in a leadership position who is teaching, less than other members of that department, I wouldn't give that teacher their own room. So I was that teacher. So I didn't give myself my own room because I knew I was teaching less than the other members of my department. So I think it's, again, like I said, data analysis. Look at who's got the high teaching loads and make sure that you're protecting the rooms for those teachers, because having a high teaching load and then moving from classroom to classroom is a real challenge. And, we want our teachers to be at their best, and teachers want their own classrooms. So, try to make it work. Of course, it's not always going to work. If you've got limited rooms and there is room sharing, think about which leaders can, share rooms. I would also say look at class sizes. Again, it's about data. So you might have subjects at A level, for example, where the numbers are not very high, especially in sort of non-core subjects that sort of get less numbers. It could be that you're a school that offers, a wide range of languages, and certain languages are more popular than others. So think about utilizing other spaces in your school. Do you have any small conference rooms? Do you have any small rooms or areas in the library where those smaller classes can be taught, which frees up the larger spaces for teachers as well? So I'd say a range of things that you can do. It is tough, and it's very much dependent on, the space that.
That's really clever. I like what you said about prioritizing teacher load. That makes complete sense. You do want to prioritize those teachers that have a higher teaching load to make sure that they do stay in the same room. That is really good advice. I was just thinking about creating option blocks. So when you were mentioning this, I was just thinking about when you have students that are making decisions, and we're trying to kind of create this agile and flexible schedule. When you're creating option blocks, do you do things like find out what student preferences are first and then make the blocks to match? Or do you create them and then try to see and kind of anticipate what you think will work best, considering the facilities and teaching staff that you have?
So I would say out of all my years of timetabling, which I think has been since 2016, I've always gone down the free choice model. Now, if you're a more established school in the UK, where sort of numbers and enrollment isn't an issue, you would probably go down the line of fixing option blocks and having pupils choose from that, which makes perfect sense because it makes your life easier as a timetable. It means that you can predetermine any constraints or conflicts. It means that you have created blocks that, not only allow, a good range of subjects to be, or complementary subjects to be chosen, but also you've thought about where the teacher constraints might be and, where teacher availability is. So that is, what most people would do. Being out here, I've always gone for free choice because the schools that I've worked at have never been at full capacity. And of course, in sort of the private education sector, you're looking to attract pupils into your school. So free choice is one way to do that because you're advertising, oh, look, you can go and study whatever you want to do. Just go and pick and we'll make it work for you. So I've always done that. And yeah, it can be tough, but I've very rarely had to tap into reserve choices, if I'm honest. I've always sort of made it work. What that means is that you do have to make compromises along the way. So, and this is where the 9-period days come in. So if you've offered all your children free choice at A level, and then you've gotten offered free choice again at GCSE, and you've created effectively 3 different option blocks, 4 actually. So you've got year 10, 11, 12 and 13. So you've created option blocks that fit your students. Then you've got to try and make them work. That is a real challenge. And I think the compromises come from, where the lessons go at the end of the day. So, you start to map out your sixth form works out, then you go for year 11, then you go down to year 10. And it could be that, you've got option block D, which has a range of subjects, and there's nowhere for that subject to go apart from period 5 and 6, perhaps on a Thursday. And so that's where the compromise is. It doesn't give you the flexibility of always putting subjects where you want them to go. But what you can do, and I think I've sort of learnt this over the years by timetabling again and again, I've learned to just, if you get your sixth form right, it can really help the situation further down. And as a timetabler, sometimes you have to painfully hit that delete button and start again when you just don't have a good enough timetable. So I've come across times where I've gotten down to year 10 and it looks so awful that I've thought, I can't deliver this. And I've hit the delete button and I've gone right the way back to sixth form and I've thought, okay, I need to move where I've timetabled these particular blocks because this is causing a problem further down for my younger students and it's not giving them the balance that I want to give them. So yeah, free choice is tough. It does mean that you've got to compromise. It does add constraints, I would say. But it does also mean that, the children in front of you get to study what they want to study.
That's really fascinating. I remember a timetabler, what they did at after sixth form option evening is they had already kind of taken and done straw polls, and they actually showed different models and said, with this model, with option blocks, 97% of our students get their first or second choices. And this one, 92% get it. And it was really, really interesting because he wanted to show, well, these are the compromises. Not everyone is going to get it perfect, but this is as close to perfect as we can get. I think when you said you have to hit the delete button, that is just terrifying. I can only imagine, because it is such a complicated puzzle, the idea of kind of saying halfway through, this puzzle isn't working, I'm going to have to dismantle it completely. That sounds incredibly painful. So I have to admire your bravery, because I think that it does take a lot to kind of say, no, I'm going to have to start from scratch. the idea of kind of looking down from sixth form, that seems like a really good tack to take. And it's really interesting because the higher up over a school, the more complicated it gets with the number of subjects that are offered as well. So I think we're going to get into that. I'm going to take a short break now just so that we can listen to the news. And then Todd is going to come back on and he's going to ask Riz some questions as well.
I've always considered myself to be a caring head teacher who acts sensitively to support staff mental health. But what I found increasingly difficult was managing the negative impact on staff mental health when resolving issues related to their employment or daily work. Heartfelt Leadership has been developed by Teachwell Toolkit as a handbook to support head teachers to overcome the challenges of school improvement while supporting staff well-being. We know that difficult conversations can quickly turn into conflict if procedures are not fully transparent, understood and followed. Our handbook takes you through step-by-step processes while maintaining mutual respect, avoiding conflict and finding solutions.
At Bloomsbury Education, we're passionate about supporting teachers with high-quality professional development books from leading experts. Whether you're navigating your first crucial years as an early career teacher or a more experienced teacher looking to refresh your practice or take a step up into leadership, our award-winning books are here to help. We publish practical books to support teaching across primary and secondary, from the very best in research-led practice to trusted advice on inclusivity, behaviour and curriculum design. Visit the Bloomsbury Education website at bloomsbury.com/education to find out more and use code BLOOMTTR24 to save 20% on all education titles. Bloomsbury Education, books for every step of your teaching journey.
This is Teachers Talk Radio News with John Gibbs. The first story this week is once again Ofsted. Following last week's news that, contrary to advice from the cross-party committee in the House of Commons, the government would persist with single-word assessments of schools. This week, Ofsted Chief Sir Martin Oliver announced that he would like Ofsted inspections to feel more like a peer review. At the Schools and Academies show on the 2nd of May, Sir Martin indicated that Ofsted had embarked on a reform journey, and he further noted that he wanted Ofsted inspections to feel like, in some ways, a peer review system. While Ofsted and Sir Martin have launched the Big Listen consultation, a group of former Ofsted inspectors, academics, experienced teachers and head teachers, led by Professor Colin Richards and Frank Norris MBE, have launched the alternative Big Listen. They've set up their own website and are accepting responses and views from across the education world. The 50% rule in English faith school admissions, introduced in 2010, stipulating that where newly established academies with a religious character are oversubscribed, at least 50% of their places would be open places, i.e. allocated without reference to faith, is to be scrapped in plans announced by the government. The government also plans to allow churches and religious groups to open faith-based schools for children with special educational needs, which campaigners warned could raise ethical issues. Proposals to scrap the 50% cap, which only applies when schools have more applicants than places, are opposed by Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, on the grounds that it would be divisive and likely to penalise disadvantaged children by denying them access to local schools. While the government believes that faith-based schools give parents greater choice, encourage better behaviour, and also academic outcomes, Andrew Copston, the Chief Executive of Humanist UK, is quoted as saying, "The proposal to allow 100% religious discrimination in new state faith schools will increase religious and racial segregation." Teaching assistants are again in the news this week. While recent stories of their declining numbers, their stagnating pay, have been regular features of the news. This week, a survey reported in Secondary Education News involving 6,000 teaching assistants in England and Wales found that 39% are covering classes for at least 5 hours a week. A further 15% say they are leading full classes for at least 11 hours a week. National guidance states that support staff should not actively teach any classes they cover, but 75% of the teaching assistants said they have ended up teaching rather than supervising. Astria Academy Trust, which controls 26 schools in the Yorkshire and Cambridgeshire area, is seeking to hire a new executive head teacher on a salary between £116,000 and £133,000 a year. These salaries might seem generous in the light that the St Ivo Academy, a secondary school in St Ives and run by the Trust, is making cuts for classroom resources, but it should also be placed in the light that the new executive principal position comes with 3 layers of management above it. Above the new executive principal would be Secondary Regional Director for Cambridgeshire, Jo Mayhill Johnson. Above her, in the Trust's hierarchy, sits Richard Tutt, its Director for Secondary Education, and above him, Rowena Hackwood, Astria's Chief Executive. And the number of Astria's employees paid at least £100,000 a year has increased from 7 to 10 from 2022 to 2023. It is reported that Ofqual have warned that exam results, GCSE and A-level, will be down this year. This will be the result of the return to pre-pandemic conditions, meaning candidates had no prior warning of what might be coming up in the exams, and the lost learning that resulted from the COVID pandemic. In an interview in Education Week, the statistician Dennis Sherwood once again stated his view that A-level and GCSE grades are only reliable to one grade either way. If you wish to listen to interviews with Dennis Sherwood, you can find them in the Teachers Talk Radio back catalogue, or follow many of these news items on the weekly review on Sunday mornings. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with John Gibbs. Thank you for listening.
Welcome back. This is Morgan Whitfield, Todd Brennan, and Riz Sheikh, and we are discussing timetabling. So just to continue on with our conversation, Riz, I wanted to ask you about equity in timetabling. And I mean equity in so many ways. We've discussed it when looking at staff loadings, but I also wanted to look at it in terms of curriculum. We've looked a little bit at some of those kind of specialty subjects. So when you look at a subject like drama or art, which might only be given a shorter period or not as much teaching time in a timetable, how do you make sure that they get the time that is needed to be impactful? There are subjects that are weighted more highly and given more time than others, which is really a demonstration of priorities within a school and a priority within our curriculum. How do you try to balance those subjects so that we have students who can explore the subjects that they are passionate about, and that teachers are given time to deliver that's meaningful?
Yeah, it's a really, really important point. And I think this is why it's really important that there's, constant reflection on the curriculum, and that you evaluate the curriculum, and, you get the opinions of the staff as well. So it could be that you think that a core subject needs X amount of hours, but then when you go and speak to them and they say, actually, I could deliver that in slightly less time. And it means that you can then give that time to the practical subjects who would really need and want that extra time. So it is important to have that balance. I wouldn't say that I would give, a practical subject exactly the same amount of time as a core subject. I genuinely wouldn't do that. I think purely because, in a core subject, the students are learning that right the way up from year 7 to year 11, and there's sort of no negotiation with that. It just has to be delivered. And then at least at year 9, they get the option of picking, other optional subjects that they would like to explore, like the arts and physical education, etc. And at that point, that is where you need to make sure that the optional subjects get an equal amount of time. Again, I wouldn't say exactly the same, but near enough. If we're talking about key stage 3, like year 7, 8, and 9, again, it's about having those conversations and again, looking at the students in front of you. What are their needs? What would help them to have a better day at school? It might actually work quite well for them to have, maybe more than one drama lesson in a week. I'm just giving a random example here, but really look at your students, what their needs are. Talk to your teachers, evaluate your curriculum, and think about where savings can be made elsewhere in the curriculum. And also just think about what you do. Sometimes we have lessons like native Arabic or Islamic, where those are compulsory subjects for a certain group of pupils, but the other groups will then have like a supervised study. So is there something else we could be doing in that time that's practical and a little bit more enjoyable for those students? It is important to have a balance, but it is quite difficult to get that equity, especially if there's not enough conversations going on and enough evaluation.
Yeah, that's really true. Again, it does come back to students and kind of looking at the context of your school. As a Canadian, I grew up in Ontario, and there the curriculum definitely prioritized history over geography. And as a geographer, I always found that so hard. I wanted to see equity in our humanities subjects that were offered. But yeah, you had to have X many hours delivered and credits for history classes as opposed to geography. And it was such an interesting thing because it does show that a national agenda can actually have a huge impact on the curriculum, and those decisions can have a huge impact on the choices that students make further down the line. So when we think about the lack of students that are now going into the arts, the emphasis on STEM subjects, the repercussions of how we design our timetables and our curriculum are really there. That's a larger curriculum conversation. I wanted to ask you a little bit about, the challenges of timetabling. What is the most difficult part of your job?
I think before I go into that, I should have also mentioned that, where certain subjects need more time, I think we can really tap into enrichment for that. So I know schools out here have quite a comprehensive after-school enrichment program. So is there any, sort of clubs that we can sort of design to sort of enrich what they're already doing in class? So that could also be, part of a solution, not a full solution, especially, as a geographer, you might want more curriculum time that, you're not given, but is there a way in which you can have an enrichment club, especially for those students who, would be keen or who you think, would really benefit from that extra club? And now going into the challenges, I would say, again, like I said, sometimes we have to hit the delete button, and that is a huge, huge challenge. And it does feel like you've done, shed loads of work that you've now got to throw in the bin. So I think the main challenge is, especially again, when you're going down the free choice route and you get down to timetabling year 10 and you realize that your lessons literally have nowhere to go, you do have to go back and redesign what you've done earlier on in the timetable. So that is a huge challenge because, that's, time constraints. You're right, you're racing against the clock to get this timetable done, but you've had to start over. So that's definitely a challenge. The other challenge would be to deal with constraints. So, and I think a lot of schools would face this naturally. So if you only have a certain number of locations, for example, to deliver your PE lessons, and you're trying to deliver specialist lessons right the way from early years all the way up to sixth form, like you said earlier on in the call, you do then have to go and schedule the PE timetable first, and that dominates your timetable. And really, there's no way around that, because if you've only got a set number of locations, you've got to make sure that those locations are utilized and optimized for everyone that needs to use them. So that is a real challenge, not having sort of enough resources to deliver that. And I'd say another constraint or challenge would be having one-man departments. And this does sometimes happen. You might have just one drama teacher, for example, who's delivering drama for all of secondary. So if you've only got one teacher to play with, quite often you need to schedule drama very early on in the timetable, which then again limits where you can put some of your other lessons because you've only got one teacher to play with. And yeah, I'd say the other challenge is with core subjects because, again, they have more curriculum time. They tend to be more popular at A level mostly, and you need a whole teacher team to be free at the same time. So it could be that you're teaching year 11 maths in sets, so you need 6 maths teachers to be free all at once for 4 or 5 lessons a week, for example. And that's a real challenge, and it becomes even more of a challenge when those teachers are teaching across different blocks at sixth form. So really the key here is you've got to design your sixth form really, really well, and where possible try not to have different subjects across too many blocks, because that really will limit your flexibility as you get further down in the timetable. So if you can bunch up a lot of maths across just 1 or 2 blocks, that will help you a lot. And also it's about educating the teachers who are going to help you with this. And I say help because the way in which I timetable is very much about firstly doing the data, getting my enrollment numbers, figuring out how many classes and sets that I need. And then I put all of that information on a spreadsheet, and I actually then give that to heads of department, and I say, you know your team best. You're involved in the appraisal for your team members. Think about what their desires and hopes are and aspirations are in terms of what groups they want to teach and where they want to develop in the teaching of your subject. And I want you to tell me who you would like teaching each set. And again, that makes my life a lot harder as a timetabler, but I quite often find that when you've kept your head of department happy, that will then go down to their team, because it means that everyone's in conversation. The head of department is having a conversation with their staff members about what they want to teach. And I think the bottom line here is we're not making any promises, but we're trying our best to go towards that. And then you give that to the timetabler, who then tries to make it work. So it is a challenge, a big challenge, trying to make it work. And you do have to educate your heads of department on blocking. And you have to say, well, these are your blocks for A level. So whichever teachers you've got teaching in this block and this block, you've got to try and keep them in separate teams as you go further down. So it's really about getting them to understand blocks, getting them to understand the concept of teacher teams, because if they get that bit right, then it helps the timetable and it doesn't feel as much of a constraint. And I'd say the other challenge that I come across is just overlapping schedules. So, producing a primary timetable that's a completely different timing structure to your secondary. And then I think we spoke about a little bit about this before, but then having specialist teachers teaching across different divisions of the school. And that's why the 20-minute blocking and trying to match up periods and timings can be quite helpful in that respect. So yeah, those are mostly a lot of the challenges. And also just in general, multi-divisional timetables are a challenge. And it's also a challenge when you try to put it into your MIS system, just purely because of how new it is. That if you've got different structures, if you've created 2 completely separate schedules, but you're trying to merge them into one, when you get into your MIS software, there are other areas of the software that doesn't quite work very well. So for example, your cover manager might not read it very well, and I've had that challenge in the past. So yeah, various challenges. And I'd say a difficult part of the job is, again, just explaining those imbalances to staff. I think staff can get quite upset when they first see their timetable, which again is why it's really important to have those conversations very early on, so that they've got an idea of what kind of classes they might be teaching next year, and just explaining why different subjects have different allocated hours, and therefore the loads are going to be different. And just thinking as a leader, how do you go about making it balanced and fair across your staff body?
Those are so many challenges that I'm amazed that a timetable is ever completely done to everyone's satisfaction, but you do have some real insight into how to make it work. I love how you said, like, bring it to HODs, like bring it to those heads of department because they know their teams best. And I know as a HOD, I always really appreciated that. I knew how I wanted to divide up when I was teaching geography, that I wanted one of my other teachers to really focus on GCSE. I would focus on the human component at A level. Another one would focus on the physical component at A level. I think it's really funny that I'm talking about geography again because we have some people texting in. Tom Rogers is saying history is better than geography, right? Which I take extreme offense to. But yes, it's really, really important to get as many people's input across the school and making sure that people feel empowered and have ownership over their small component of the timetable. I was just thinking about what you said in terms of flexibility, because you do want to have flexibility built into your timetable as well. I'm thinking, for instance, when we have exams approaching, all of a sudden we somehow have to create a space that didn't exist before, or basically block off a space that was previously being used so that we have space for exams. Or if it gets extremely hot in the summer, for instance, and students can no longer play on the sports pitch, what do you do? Where are you kind of negotiating the curriculum and those spaces so that PE lessons can still happen? How do you build in flexibility into the timetable and kind of anticipate how those spaces might be used differently at different points in the year?
Yeah, it's a real challenge. So it very much depends how many sort of areas you've got to deliver the PE. So I think I'm quite fortunate right now that we have, many different areas where it can be delivered, and it's been thought about in advance, what we would do when the weather gets too hot. But again, it's about being creative and looking at other areas of the school. So I know what we did in my last school was we found a large area, which absolutely wasn't a PE area, but we managed to fit some table tennis boards in there, and we delivered that as part of PE. It could be that you look at other areas in the city where you could take, especially if you've got an afternoon lesson and there's some scope for some travel. Is it possible for you to go down to, say, Zayed Sports City or other areas in the city that might be nearby to have indoor PE lessons or indoor cricket or something along those lines? So I think really it's about creativity, looking at the spaces that you do have that could potentially be used, and then looking at areas around the city that you could logistically get to in time to at least have, some sort of decent PE lesson. It is really challenging, and I think a lot of schools face that challenge, but it is about finding those creative solutions.
It's really funny. I remember during COVID, one of my schools actually using a community center because we could only have so many people or so many students in a classroom, so we needed more space. And so utilizing that community center was amazing. When I was teaching in Canada, we often had snow days, and it meant that some of our facilities would be shut down, and we had to use facilities that were next door that actually belonged to the city. So I think you're right, being creative and not being afraid to kind of look at external providers outside the school and how you can partner with them to kind of expand your spaces. But yeah, it is tricky. I've seen it be that tricky. I wanted to ask a question about SEND students and looking at how we can make sure that with a 2-week timetable where it's limited, when you have kind of looking at that inclusion department, how do you make sure that your timetable is kind and that it doesn't have a knock-on effect with vulnerable students?
Again, it's about including your inclusion team in that timetabling process. And sometimes you don't know who your SEND students are going to be. It could be that you have an influx of new pupils coming into the school and, their needs are not identified straight away. But for the ones where you do know what their needs are going to be, it's about having the correct conversation. So it could be that you're looking at a transition between year 6 and year 7. Where you might be placing them into sort of compass groups or class groups, having that interaction with the inclusion department and just looking at where you would place those kids, and then, where would you place the lessons so that, you've got enough inclusion team members to help support in class without causing too many conflicts elsewhere. And I would say quite often the timetable is created and then given to the inclusion team, and then the inclusion team sort of maps out, where they can support and help out. So it's a tricky question to be.
Yeah, I think you always come back to stakeholders. We're just going to have a little word from our sponsors. And then I wanted to ask you a little bit about pastoral care and tutor time. So let's just listen to this first.
I've always considered myself to be a caring head teacher who acts sensitively to support staff mental health. But what I found increasingly difficult was managing the negative impact on staff mental health when resolving issues related to their employment or daily work. Heartfelt Leadership has been developed by Teachwell Toolkit as a handbook to support head teachers to overcome the challenges of school improvement while supporting staff well-being. We know that difficult conversations can quickly turn into conflict if procedures are not fully transparent, understood and followed. Our handbook takes you through step-by-step processes while maintaining mutual respect, avoiding conflict and finding solutions.
At Bloomsbury Education, we're passionate about supporting teachers with high-quality professional development books from leading experts. Whether you're navigating your first crucial years as an early career teacher or a more experienced teacher looking to refresh your practice or take a step up into leadership, our award-winning books are here to help. We publish practical books to support teaching across primary and secondary, from the very best in research-led practice to trusted advice on inclusivity, behaviour and curriculum design. Visit the Bloomsbury Education website at bloomsbury.com/education to find out more, and use code BLOOMTTR24 to save 20% on all education titles. Bloomsbury Education, books for every step of your teaching journey.
This is Teachers.
So, Riz, right before we had our word from our sponsors, we were going to talk about tutor time. I was just wondering, in terms of shape of the day and when to place tutor time and how much to give. Right now at my current school, we are looking at placing our tutor time not at the very beginning of the day during registration, but kind of giving it a more preeminent spot by having it after lunchtime and kind of placing it in the middle of the day. And I see Todd has actually joined us again. So I'm hoping after you can maybe give an answer, Todd can ask a few questions that I know that he has burning of you as well.
Okay, I personally quite like, as a tutor myself right now, I quite like seeing my form class first thing in the morning so that I'm able to give them the relevant notices that they need for the day, so that I'm able to really set the standard in terms of checking their uniform and checking that they've got everything that they need, checking their planners, seeing, what assessments are coming up for them, etc. So I quite like seeing them first thing in the morning to just set that standard. So I think it's really important over here for schools to collaborate, because different schools do different things, and it's really important to, just check what other schools are doing and what's worked for them. So yeah, there are some schools that will do registration at the end of the day or in the middle of the day. My school that I worked at in the UK, we would have a quick registration in the morning and then another one right after lunch just to check in again. So I quite like the idea of seeing them twice a day just to make sure that you are that familiar face, because it could be that you don't teach your tutor group, or like right now, for example, I only actually teach my tutor group maths Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday. So I actually don't see them in lessons Thursday and Friday. And so for any latecomers that have come in, I might not see them at all during the day if they haven't come in at tutor time. So I quite like having the tutor time first thing in the morning and then perhaps having another shorter check-in. I do think you need to allocate enough time to have meaningful tutor time. So I've worked in places where tutor time was just about registration, and it's like 10 minutes at the start of the day and you've got to register them, quickly give their notices and off you go, see you later. And I think that extended tutor time is really, really important so that you're able to actually deliver things. So some things that I've done with my form class this year, I've had different themes for each month. So January was all about emotional intelligence. So some of our tutor times in the morning, so we have about 25 minutes first thing in the morning. So some of that was dedicated to learning about emotional intelligence and thinking about how to give emotionally intelligent responses. And then February was about digital detox. So we spoke all about screen time and what can we do to reduce our screen time and how do we have a healthy sort of digital life. So I think that the answer to the question is just make sure you've got adequate time. So whether that's at the beginning of the day or in the middle of the day, as long as it's not 10 minutes and you've actually got quality time with your form to have those personal conversations, that's what's really.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I agree. Having that time first thing in the morning to do that check-in seems so vital, but then being able to then touch them at the middle of the day and say, okay, at this point this is where I can get some quality kind of PSHME curriculum in, seems really key. Todd, what do you think?
Hoping you can hear me because I've been trying to. No.
Oh, I think you've cut out, Todd.
Oh no! Can you hear me now?
There, yep, can hear you perfectly now.
Okay. No, I was just enjoying listening and I was trying to jump in. But I was really enjoying listening to you, Riz, talk about how you are very transparent with people below, at the same rung of the ladder as you in terms of hierarchy. But what about managing it upwards? Because a lot of what you're talking about really is about culture and climate of a school, isn't it? And you want to kind of have that set through conversations with the principal or head teacher of the particular school. At what point do you try to involve them in the process? Because I think a lot of people, as you alluded to, they release the information very much last minute in the hope that it relieves any problems. So where in the process are the people responsible for the overall culture of the school?
I would say at the start, to be honest. So, whilst you're designing a curriculum, if you are a curriculum lead in your school, it's not just your decision to say, oh, okay, I think it should be X, Y, and Z, and I'm just going to run with it. That has to have approval from your stakeholders, and those stakeholders are the people above you, which would include your principal. So your principal very much has to be sort of in line with curriculum decisions. And again, it's that open conversation, regular checking in. I quite often talk about staff loads. I quite often talk about, okay, how are we going to manage staff loads? How can we balance those loads with different duties, with cover, etc., just to ensure that there's fairness and parity. And don't be afraid to get your principal involved. If there are decisions to be made and you need support on that front in front of staff, I think it should be a process that's sort of united.
No, that really came across in a lot of your answers, and I think I had sort of mentioned earlier that my experience of this is quite limited, and that I put the comments up above about SEND. I felt at times I found it easier to do a 2-week timetable, and that's just the way my brain works. But I found it very challenging to do a 1 week, and it was actually for a setting that was had a lot of EBD needs, and it just was completely inappropriate. But it was what I could manage. So it was interesting again hearing how you'd sort of considered that from that angle. In terms of what, obviously we've talked a lot about UAE sort of centric things, but where do part-time staff fit in with all of this? Is that something that you've dealt with? Because it's certainly not within my experiences. And I can just imagine from everything we've spoken about today that would just throw another spanner in the works. In terms of making sure that it's equitable and that it serves the students and the stakeholders.
Yeah, part-time is really tricky. I've probably dealt with it maybe once or twice here. It's not very common to have part-time teachers here in the UAE, but it can happen. It does happen. Sometimes you have, when you have a maternity leave and you find like a great cover teacher who can only work 3 or 4 days. It's about, again, really thinking about what it is that you want them to deliver. And that's where I said flexibility in a timetable is quite important. So it could be, if we just use maternity leave as an example, if someone's gone off on maternity leave and you've got a cover teacher coming in who can only teach 3 days a week, I would consider who else in that department can take some of those lessons, but where else can I release other lessons that could fit in that 3-day week? And sometimes you do have to make odd decisions like having shared classes or split teaching, which I don't like to do. For me, that's more a last resort, because I do think there's real value and benefit of, you know, students having the same teacher for their lessons in a particular subject. But in terms of part-time, I would, you know, if someone says I can only work Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, if this is at the start of the timetable process, they become your constraint. So they've got to go into your timetable early on in the process, otherwise it won't work. You can't create a timetable, then try to chuck in your part-timer afterwards, because it will collapse, it won't work. But if it's mid-year, which can happen, this is where the flexibility from the beginning is important. Think about what lessons you can shift to other members of the team and where can you release them that would help fit into that 3-day week for that particular part-time.
No, it's really good, and I like that idea of that flexibility from the beginning. I tried to jump in at that point. It's I think it is my technology, to be honest. If I'm breaking up still, let's imagine someone's listening and they're crazy enough to think that they want to take it on in their school, or they want to kind of, you know, develop to a point where they can get involved in this. They've listened to this and thought, wow, I can really actually have a big impact on a scale I didn't know possible before. Where did you start, and where would you advise people to start? Because I often find when I'm self-taught, and it sounds like you've used your background in maths really and taught yourself. What sort of mistakes did you make in training yourself, if that's what you did, and where would you suggest somebody else started, Riz?
Oh, that's a lovely question. I think my current principle is very much about learn through play, and I could just hear him say learn through play, because that's exactly what I did. I literally learned and taught myself how to do the timetable simply by playing with it. And yeah, I did. I think my maths knowledge, just my knowledge of numbers and using Excel helped quite a lot. I mean, there are people who can do a whole school timetable without using any kind of software at all, and they will do it all on Excel. But those are the people that will probably lock themselves away in a dark room for about 3 or 4 months with no interaction with the world, if they are doing it on Excel, purely because it takes so long. So I would say anyone who's interested in timetabling, you know, get hold of, you know, a good software package. There's loads of software packages out there. People quite like Anova T6. Some people like Keith Johnson. I've only ever used Keith Johnson. It's quite self-explanatory, I would say, the software itself, in terms of the user friendliness. It's quite easy to use. Just have a play around. Imagine you're creating your own school that only has 2 classes and you're delivering 6 subjects. Start small, see what you can do, see if you can get a timetable that actually fits. So it's very much about creating a puzzle. I think the first timetable that I ever wrote, I ended up hitting delete. I think I just like the delete button, perhaps. So yeah, the first one that I created, it all fit, but I just didn't like it. I just thought, there's no balance. This year group have a horrible timetable. I can't run through with this. And then when I deleted it and I started again, I created a much better schedule. And I think that happens, even though I've been doing this for years. Sometimes I look at it and I'm like, no, I can do better than that. So I go for it again. So don't be afraid to play. And I think if you enjoy it enough, it becomes less painful deleting and starting again. But what mistakes did I make? I think one of my biggest blunders, I don't know if I should say this on a live show, but it's all good. I think the biggest mistake I've ever made wasn't even at the start of my journey of timetabling. It's when I would say I was at quite a good level of timetabling. I completely misread an option block. So I did the whole timetable. I thought I had completely cracked it. I sent it to my heads of department. They were happy with it. And it got to import stage, and I'd gone off for the summer. I'd gone to England. Luckily, I took my laptop. And the data manager that I used to work with said, you know, you've got children who have picked biology in Block C, but your timetable doesn't have a biology at all in Block C. And I was like, that's not possible. I checked this, like, how is that possible? I immediately opened my laptop, and indeed, I did not timetable biology in the block it was meant to go. And yeah, that can be extremely...
biology, really? Is it that important, really?
Or when it's year 13, Todd, it is. So how did I go about fixing it? Well, I tried to go back and timetable it in the correct block. Now, you can imagine if you've actually created the whole schedule from nursery right the way up to year 13, and then you try to move an option block, it wasn't going to work out. So I can't even remember. It was such a long time ago. There are a couple of things that you can do. And sometimes, when you're timetabling sixth form, try to give yourself some flexibility by having like an out of block lesson. So see if there's a double period where there are no lessons and it could be a study area for sixth form. So what I would have done is for the lessons that didn't fit, I would have put them out of block. I then went back to the actual kids. Because I knew there was going to be no change because it was year 13, I was checking, are any of these kids Muslim or native? So could I put a lesson blocked against Islamic for year 13 or native Arabic for year 13? I checked if that could work. Then I had to break the news to the biology teacher. I'm surprised she's still my friend. But she was thankfully okay about it. And she said, okay, it's all right. We can work it out. And so I did actually end up, so where I had to place the lessons, it meant that she couldn't teach one of her single year 10 lessons. So then we thought about who else in the department could take that single and could we adapt the biology curriculum a little bit so that perhaps that teacher teaches a topic across a series of weeks. So we managed to work something out. And this is where it's helpful to have people who are sort of flexible towards your needs. And again, I'm going to go back to that open communication. If you've communicated with your staff and your heads of department, I think they'll respect you more, so that if you do make a blunder like I did, they'll be more, keen to adapt and help you fix that problem, as opposed to if you just didn't involve them in the process at all and you went ahead and said, there you go, there's your timetable, deal with it. And then you say you've made a mistake, it might actually be harder to deal with. So my big advice for any timetabler would be make sure you get a second pair of eyes to check your activity batches, especially if you're going to duplicate batches from previous years and edit them, which is exactly what I did. I duplicated my year 12 into 13. I had minor changes with the option blocks. But ironically, that ended up stealing my time because of my oversight. So yeah, just make sure you've got a second pair of eyes, whether that's a head of department that you trust, that can help you look over your batches and the actual option blocks, whether it's the person who's going to do the import for you or your data manager. Just make sure someone else is checking your work, because the screen can become quite large with loads of different little squares all over the place. So it's quite difficult to see, especially if you're timetabling across 2 weeks. It is really easy to make a mistake. So it's always helpful to get someone else involved in the process to just help you check things, really.
I'm always impressed because I've seen timetablers who have 2 or 3 monitors up in front of them, or those huge, massive monitors. I didn't even know that they made them that big, and they just seem so necessary. Timetablers that are still squinting. So I'm always really impressed with the work. Riz, I'm always impressed with you because not only do you timetable, you also teach. You also do assessment. I'm amazed that you are able to balance those responsibilities on top of everything else that you do. So I just want to kind of give you a round of applause because you are an incredible timetabler on top of being an incredible educator. It has been such a joy to have you on. I feel like I've learned so much and gained so much insight. As someone who isn't a timetabler at all, I feel like I have a greater understanding. So thank you so much for joining us today. Your expertise is really appreciated.
Thank you so much, Morgan, and thank you for inviting me onto the show. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. Really good insight. Really enjoyed that.
Todd, do you want to add anything before we close out?
No, I was going to throw another question in because I think I could carry on asking Riz questions all evening, but I don't think we're allowed to. So I was going to ask something about dark arts. Have you ever given yourself a really nice timetable? But let's not ask Riz that.
Riz is far too moral. I know her too well. She would never.
No, for the record, I'm not. But maybe I should, Todd.
I'm pretty sure.
No, but in
You've
all seriousness,
only ever
I could have-
taken on others' burdens. I know. With that, we come to a close. Thank you so much for joining us on the Wednesday Twilight Show. We can't wait to speak to all of our listeners again and hear what you have to say. Text in 2 weeks from now. Thank you all so much and have a lovely evening.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.